Turn around and put your hands on the hood." Officer Bruce Miller roared, his hand gripping his nightstick so tightly his knuckles turned white against the flashing strobe lights. Leonard, 72 years old, spat a mouthful of copper-tasting blood onto the dusty asphalt. His wire-rimmed glasses lay shattered near his polished shoes, but his dark eyes remained entirely unafraid. "I did nothing wrong, officer," Leonard stated, his baritone voice cutting through the humid silence. Bruce shoved him violently against the vintage Impala. "In Oak Ridge, I decide what's wrong." The late afternoon sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of County Road 9 with the intensity of a blast furnace, sending shimmering waves of heat rising from the blacktop. Inside the impeccably restored 1968 Chevrolet Impala, the air conditioning hummed a soft, steady rhythm, an oasis of cool leather and polished chrome. At the wheel sat Leonard. At 72, his posture remained as rigid and unyielding as the iron girders he had spent 40 years welding together before his retirement. He wore a crisp, powder blue linen suit, a sartorial choice dedicated to his granddaughter's upcoming piano recital, an event he had been looking forward to for 3 agonizingly slow months. Leonard loved this car. It was more than a machine, it was a metallic tapestry of his life's patience. He had bought it as a rusted-out shell at a police auction 5 years ago, spending countless midnight hours in his garage breathing life back into its dormant V8 engine. It was a masterpiece of cherry-red paint and chrome that caught the dying sunlight and threw it back at the world like a challenge. He tapped his fingers rhythmically against the steering wheel to the faint sound of Sam Cooke crooning from the vintage-style radio, his mind occupied with the sheet music he had bought as a surprise gift. He was exactly 3 miles from the city limits of Oak Ridge, a town nestled deep in the valley that still clung to the archaic, shadowy prejudices of a bygone era. Leonard knew Oak Ridge. He knew its unwritten rules and its whispered warnings. He always drove exactly 2 miles below the speed limit here. In his rearview mirror, a sudden, violent burst of red and blue shattered his peaceful reverie. The police cruiser materialized from the dusty haze behind him like a predator rising from the brush. The siren offered a brief, aggressive yelp of demand, not a request. Leonard's heart performed a familiar, weary flutter against his ribs. The cold dread that every black man of his generation carried deep in his marrow, an ancestral survival instinct, flooded his veins. He checked his speedometer, 43 in a 45 zone. His tags were current. His taillights were functioning. He signaled precisely 100 feet before carefully easing the heavy Impala onto the gravel shoulder, the tires crunching softly as a cloud of fine white dust plumed around the rear bumper. He placed the car in park, turned off the engine, and rolled down his window. Both hands went immediately to the top of the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. He stared straight ahead, breathing in the scent of dry pine and hot dust that wafted through the open window, bracing himself. In the side mirror, he watched the driver's door of the cruiser swing open. Officer Bruce Miller stepped out, adjusting his heavy utility belt with a practiced, arrogant swagger. Bruce was a man who wore his authority like a loaded weapon. His uniform was tight across his broad, muscular chest, and his eyes, hidden behind mirrored aviator sunglasses, were fixed on the cherry-red Impala. On the passenger side, a younger officer, Tiffany, stepped out tentatively. She was fresh out of the academy, her uniform still stiff, her eyes wide, and nervously scanning the desolate stretch of road. Bruce approached with agonizing slowness, his hand resting casually, yet purposefully, on the butt of his sidearm. He stopped just behind the driver's side door, forcing Leonard to turn his neck awkwardly to see him. It was a classic intimidation tactic. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Bruce barked, his voice devoid of professional courtesy, dripping instead with a condescending drawl. "Good afternoon, officer," Leonard replied, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that remained perfectly calm. "My wallet is in my right breast pocket, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I will need to reach for them." Bruce leaned closer, resting his forearms on the roof of the pristine Impala. He dragged a thick finger along the polished drip rail, intentionally smudging the flawless wax job. "I know this car," Bruce muttered, almost to himself, a dark realization creeping over his features. "Police auction in 21. I put a bid on this piece of junk." The auctioneer said some out-of-towner outbid me by $50 in the final seconds. Leonard offered no reaction. He simply waited for permission to move. He remembered the auction well. He had seen the off-duty cop glaring at him from across the lot when the gavel fell. "You deaf, old man?" Bruce snapped, his frustration instantly boiling over into manufactured rage. "I said give me your papers." "I am waiting for your permission to reach for them, officer," Leonard repeated, his tone unwavering, though a bead of sweat slowly traced its way down his temple. "Stop playing games with me," Bruce hissed, stepping up to the window. He leaned his head inside, his breath smelling stale, like black coffee and chewing tobacco. "You think you can come into my town, driving the car I wanted, wearing a suit you probably stole, and give me attitude?" "I am not giving you attitude," Leonard said softly. "And I bought this suit. Get out of the car." "Officer, I am perfectly willing to provide my—" "I said get out of the damn car." Bruce roared, his hand flying through the open window. He grabbed the handle from the inside, yanking the door open with such violent force that it bounced against the heavy hinges. Officer Tiffany took a hesitant step forward, her hand hovering near her radio. "Bruce," she said softly, her voice trembling. "He's not resisting. Just let him get his wallet." "Shut up, Tiff. I handle the stops," Bruce snapped back without looking at her. He reached in, grabbed Leonard by the lapels of his pristine blue suit, and hauled the elderly man out of the vehicle. Leonard stumbled as his polished shoes hit the uneven gravel, but he managed to catch his balance. He stood to his full height 6 foot even, and looked Bruce directly in the mirrored lenses of his sunglasses. It was a look not of defiance, but of profound, unshakable dignity. It was the look of a man who had survived worse men than Bruce Miller. And that was what broke Bruce. The lack of fear, the absolute refusal to cower. "You think that tailored suit makes you somebody in my town?" Bruce snarled, the veins in his thick neck bulging against his collar. "I simply asked you why I was being stopped, officer," Leonard stated, his voice carrying the calm resonance of a tolling bell. Bruce's right arm pulled back, the thick leather of his tactical glove groaning under the tension, and he swung. The backhand strike caught Leonard across the left cheekbone with a sickening, wet crack. The force of the blow snapped the elderly man's head to the side, knocking his wire-rimmed glasses off his face to shatter on the gravel below. Leonard staggered backward, his shoulders slamming into the side of the Impala. A thin trickle of bright crimson blood immediately began to pool at the corner of his mouth. Tiffany gasped, taking a horrified step backward, her hand flying to her mouth. Leonard slowly turned his head back to face his attacker. He did not raise his hands to defend himself. He did not yell. He simply tasted the copper on his tongue, looked at Bruce Miller, and said, "Is that the best you have, son?" Enraged beyond reason, Bruce unclipped his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for assaulting a police officer and resisting arrest. Turn around and put your hands on the trunk." Now, Natalie's hands were shaking so violently she nearly dropped the steaming glass pot of decaf coffee. She stood frozen behind the counter of Nat's Diner and Bakery, a quaint, retro-style establishment that sat directly across from the dusty shoulder of County Road 9. The diner was empty, save for the low hum of the refrigerated pastry display and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Through the large, smudged front window, she had watched the entire horrifying tableau unfold. She had seen the red Impala pull over. She had seen Bruce Miller's aggressive posture. And she had seen the brutal, unprovoked slap that sent the elderly black man stumbling into the side of his car. A cold, jagged knot of terror tightened in Natalie's stomach. She knew Bruce Miller. Everyone in Oak Ridge knew Bruce Miller. He was the town's apex predator, operating under the absolute protection of his older sister, Rebecca Miller, the presiding judge of the county courthouse. To cross Bruce was to invite the full, crushing weight of the local judicial system down upon your life. He could ruin a business with endless health inspections or manufacture traffic tickets until a person lost their license and livelihood. Natalie instinctively reached up and touched the small, blinking green light on the corner of the ceiling. 3 months ago, after a string of late-night break-ins, she had installed a high-definition security camera system. The camera positioned above the pie display pointed directly out the front window, capturing a perfect, unobstructed view of County Road 9. It was recording everything. Across the street, Bruce was violently shoving the handcuffed elderly man into the back of the cruiser. The rookie, Tiffany, stood by, looking physically sick, her face pale and drawn. Natalie scrambled behind the counter, dropping to her knees by the small office door. She crawled inside and booted up the DVR monitor. The playback was horrifyingly clear. The audio wasn't perfect through the glass, but the visual of the assault was undeniable. Bruce's face, contorted in rage. The heavy strike, the shattered glasses on the gravel. The chime of the diner's front door shattered the silence like a gunshot. Natalie jumped, her head cracking against the underside of her desk. She scrambled to her feet, smoothing down her apron, trying to force her breathing into a normal rhythm. Bruce Miller strolled in. The bell on the door was still swaying. He took off his mirrored sunglasses, wiping a speck of dust from the lens. He looked flushed, his chest still heaving slightly from the adrenaline of his manufactured dominance. "Hey there, Nat," Bruce said, his voice a sickeningly sweet drawl. He walked over to the counter, leaning his heavy elbows on the Formica top. "Hot one out there today, huh?" "Yes. Very hot, Bruce," Natalie managed to stammer out, silently praying he couldn't see the violent trembling of her hands. "Just had a bit of a scuffle out front," Bruce continued casually, nodding toward the window. "Crazy old guy from out of town. He got belligerent. Took a swing at me when I asked for his ID. Had to use necessary force to subdue him. It's a damn shame what the world is coming to, people having zero respect for the badge." He stared at her. His pale blue eyes were cold, calculating, probing her face for any sign of contradiction. It wasn't a recounting of events. It was a script delivery, and he was waiting for her to accept her role. "That's terrible, Bruce," she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Yeah, good thing it didn't spill over into your lot." Bruce's gaze slowly drifted upward, landing squarely on the blinking green light of the new security camera in the corner. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the diner. "New system?" he asked, pointing a thick finger at the ceiling. "Just installed it," Natalie whispered. "The break-ins." Right. Smart move," Bruce smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Tell me, Nat, does that thing point out the window?" Natalie's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. If she said yes, he would demand the footage. If she refused, he would take it by force, or worse, come back with a warrant signed by his sister to seize all her electronics. "No," she lied smoothly, a sudden surge of protective adrenaline overriding her fear. "It only covers the cash register and the pie display. The glare from the window blinds the sensor anyway." Bruce stared at her for a long, agonizing 10 seconds. Finally, he tapped the counter twice. "Good. Keep your eyes on the money, Nat. I'll see you around." He turned and walked out, the bell chiming cheerfully behind him. Natalie collapsed against the counter, gasping for air as if she had been underwater. Meanwhile, miles away at the Oak Ridge precinct, Tiffany sat in the women's locker room, staring at her reflection in the smudged mirror. She had just finished typing her portion of the arrest report. Suspect became combative. Officer Miller deployed open-handed compliance strike. Suspect secured without further incident. It was a lie, a bold-faced, perjurious lie. She turned on the faucet, splashing freezing water onto her face. When she took the oath 6 months ago, she genuinely believed she was going to be a shield for the vulnerable. Instead, she had just stood by and watched a wolf tear into an innocent lamb. And worse, she had helped the wolf bury the bones. The blue wall of silence was not a myth. It was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. She remembered the look in the old man's eyes as they fingerprinted him. He hadn't asked for a lawyer yet. He hadn't made a single phone call. He simply sat in the holding cell, his cheek bruised a dark, ugly purple, waiting with a terrifying, unnatural patience. It wasn't the patience of a defeated man. It was the patience of a man who knew a storm was coming. Special Agent Scott Miller, no relation to the corrupt officer currently booking his father, an irony that would soon prove lethal to the Oak Ridge Police Department, sat in a high-backed leather chair inside the FBI field office in Chicago. The room was a sterile, climate-controlled sanctuary of glass and steel, a stark contrast to the dusty corruption of Oak Ridge. At 34, Scott was a rising star in the bureau. He was the lead architect of the Public Corruption Unit, a man known for his icy demeanor and his terrifyingly methodical approach to dismantling criminal syndicates. He didn't just arrest people, he financially, legally, and socially vivisected them. Currently, his office walls were plastered with a massive corkboard webbed with red string, surveillance photos, and bank statements. The title card at the top of the board read, Operation Glasshouse. The target of the operation? The Honorable Judge Rebecca Miller and the Oak Ridge County Police Department. For 2 years, Scott had been building a staggering RICO case against Rebecca and her network of enforcers, chief among them being her brother, Bruce. They were running an extortion racket, seizing properties through falsified tax liens, utilizing civil asset forfeiture to steal cash from out-of-state drivers, and running a protection ring for local narcotics distributors. Scott had the bank transfers. He had the wiretaps. What he lacked was the singular, undeniable catalyst to drop the federal hammer and execute the 50 simultaneous arrest warrants sitting in his desk drawer. His encrypted cell phone vibrated on the glass desk. The caller ID flashed Aunt Martha. Scott frowned, picking up the device. Aunt Martha? Is everything all right? Scott. The elderly woman's voice was trembling, thick with tears. It's your father. It's Leonard. Scott's posture instantly shifted, the relaxed agent vanishing, replaced by a coiled spring. What happened? Is it his heart? No, baby. He's in jail. Down in that awful Oak Ridge place. He was driving down for Lily's piano recital. The police there, they called me to come get his car from impound. The desk sergeant laughed when I asked what happened. He said your father assaulted an officer. The silence on the line stretched out, heavy and absolute. Assaulted an officer, Scott repeated, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a flat, terrifying monotone. His father, Leonard, was a pacifist who spent his weekends planting tomatoes and reading historical biographies. The man had never raised his voice in 72 years, let alone a fist. They won't let him out, Scott, Martha sobbed. The judge there, some woman named Miller, she denied him bail before he even saw a courtroom. Said he was a flight risk. They hurt him, Scott. The towing guy said there was blood on the driver's side door. Scott slowly closed his eyes. The image of his gentle, dignified father bleeding on the side of a dirt road flashed behind his eyelids, igniting a white-hot furnace of rage deep within his chest. It was a primal, violent anger, one that urged him to drive to Oak Ridge, kick down the precinct doors, and beat Bruce Miller to a bloody pulp with his bare hands. But Scott was not a street brawler. He was an apex predator of the justice system. He opened his eyes and looked at the corkboard. He looked at the smug, surveillance photo of Bruce Miller. He looked at the official portrait of Judge Rebecca Miller. They had no idea who they had just pulled over. They had no idea that the quiet elderly man in the vintage Impala was the father of the federal agent who had been watching their every move for 24 months. Aunt Martha, listen to me very carefully, Scott said, his voice eerily calm, the sound of a blade being drawn from a leather sheath. Do not go to the police station. Do not call a local lawyer. You stay home and lock your doors. But what about Leonard? I am going to Oak Ridge, Scott said, pulling open the bottom drawer of his desk. He reached past his spare magazines and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope containing the federally approved RICO indictments. I will handle this. Scott, they are dangerous people down there. They own the town. They don't own me, Scott whispered. He hung up the phone. He stood up, his movements precise and mechanical. He walked over to the coat rack, sliding his arms into a tailored, charcoal gray suit. He adjusted his tie in the reflection of the glass window overlooking the Chicago skyline. He didn't look like a son rushing to save his father. He looked like an executioner heading to the gallows. He picked up his briefcase, sliding the RICO indictments inside, alongside a portable encrypted hard drive containing 3,000 hours of wiretaps. He tapped his earpiece, connecting directly to his tactical supervisor. Supervisor Reynolds, Scott said, striding out of his office and down the fluorescent-lit hallway. Go ahead, Scott. Operation Glasshouse is going hot. Assemble the HRT strike teams and the federal marshals. I want 50 agents staged at the county line of Oak Ridge by 0800 hours tomorrow. Understood. What's the trigger? A dark, dangerous smile ghosts across Scott's lips, though his eyes remained frozen. I have a court appearance tomorrow morning. Arraignment court. Judge Rebecca Miller presiding. You're going in alone? I'm going in to introduce myself, Scott replied, stepping into the elevator, and then we burn their kingdom to the ground. The doors slid shut. The storm was no longer gathering. It was already in motion. The Oak Ridge County Courthouse was a towering, imposing structure of gray granite and darkened windows, built less as a hall of justice and more as a monument to the Miller family's unchallenged authority. Inside Courtroom 3B, the air was thick, smelling of lemon polish, old paper, and the stale sweat of desperate people. Leonard was led into the room through the heavy side door. He had been stripped of his powder blue suit, forced instead into a coarse, oversized orange jumpsuit that hung awkwardly on his frame. Heavy iron chains linked his wrists to his waist, and another chain hobbled his ankles. Yet, despite the shackles, despite the angry purple bruise swelling shut his left eye, Leonard walked with the upright, regal posture of a king surveying a lesser kingdom. He did not look at the floor. He looked straight ahead. In the front row of the gallery sat Officer Bruce Miller, out of uniform, wearing a tight polo shirt that clung to his muscular frame. He slouched in the wooden pew, chewing a piece of gum with a smug, open-mouthed rhythm. He met Leonard's gaze and offered a dark, mocking wink. Sitting high above them all, draped in voluminous black robes, was the Honorable Judge Rebecca Miller. She bore a striking resemblance to her brother, the same pale, calculating eyes, the same sharp, predatory jawline. She wielded her wooden gavel like an executioner's axe, her rulings swift, merciless, and always aligned with the financial interests of her family's syndicate. Case number 44-098, State of Variable versus Leonard. Rebecca glanced down at the docket, her lips curling into a sneer. No last name provided? John Doe? He refused to speak during booking, Your Honor, the sniveling county prosecutor, a man whose entire career depended on Rebecca's favor, chimed in. We have him on aggravated assault of a police officer, resisting arrest, and failure to comply. The state requests he be remanded without bail, given he is an out-of-towner and a severe flight risk. I have a name, Leonard said, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the murmurs of the courtroom. It echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings. My name is Leonard Miller, and I am not a flight risk. I am simply a man waiting for his son. Bruce scoffed loudly from the gallery. Rebecca banged her gavel once, though she directed her sharp gaze solely at Leonard. Speak only when spoken to, Mr. Miller. Given the severity of the charges against a decorated officer of this town, I am inclined to agree with the state. Bail is DI. The heavy, double oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a massive, echoing crack. Every head in the room snapped around. Special Agent Scott Miller stood in the threshold. He was a terrifying vision of absolute, tailored authority. His charcoal gray suit was immaculately cut, armor for the modern gladiator. In his right hand, he carried a thick, black leather briefcase. His face was a mask of cold, chiseled granite, his eyes scanning the room, absorbing every detail, every threat, and logging it away. He didn't walk down the center aisle. He marched. His leather shoes struck the hardwood floor with a rhythmic, military precision. The bailiff, an older man with a paunch, stepped forward to intercept him, his hand resting on his service weapon. Hold it right there, sir. You need to pass the metal detector, the bailiff warned. Scott didn't even break his stride. He fluidly reached into his inner breast pocket, produced a leather wallet, and flipped it open, holding it up so the gold shield caught the fluorescent lighting. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Scott announced, his voice a flat, commanding baritone that immediately sucked the oxygen out of the room. Stand aside, deputy. The bailiff went pale, instantly taking a wide step back. In the gallery, Bruce Miller stopped chewing his gum. He sat up straight, his smug demeanor vanishing, replaced by a sudden, feral wariness. Scott bypassed the wooden swinging gate, ignoring the prosecutor completely, and stepped directly up to the defense table. He looked down at his father. Leonard looked back up at his son, the ghost of a proud, weary smile touching his unbruised cheek. Are you all right, Dad? Scott whispered, his voice cracking just a fraction, a brief sliver of humanity slipping through the icy exterior. "I am now," Leonard replied softly. Scott turned to face the bench. Judge Rebecca Miller was staring at him, her knuckles white as she gripped her gavel. For the first time in 10 years, she looked unsure of herself in her own courtroom. "Who the hell are you?" Rebecca demanded, abandoning all legal decorum. "And what gives you the right to interrupt my courtroom?" "My name is Supervisory Special Agent Scott Miller, lead director of the Chicago Public Corruption Task Force," Scott said, his voice carrying flawlessly to the back of the room. He snapped open his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents bearing the thick, blue seal of the United States Department of Justice. "I am here on behalf of my father, Leonard Miller." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Bruce stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the wood floor. "This is a state matter, Agent Miller," Rebecca said, attempting to regain her composure, though her voice wavered slightly. "Your federal badge holds no jurisdiction over a local assault charge." "It does when the assault charge is a fabricated cover for a civil rights violation," Scott countered smoothly, stepping closer to the bench. "And it certainly holds jurisdiction over the 52 counts of federal racketeering, wire fraud, and extortion currently being filed against this courthouse." Rebecca's face lost all its color. It was as if someone had pulled a plug and drained her blood. You have no proof of such absurd allegations." "I have 3,000 hours of wiretaps, Your Honor," Scott said, dropping a thick manila envelope onto the prosecutor's desk, "including a very enlightening conversation from last Tuesday where you and your brother discussed routing a $70,000 civil asset forfeiture through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. I am submitting this federal transfer order. My father is coming with me. Now." "Bailiffs," Rebecca shrieked, panic finally cracking her facade. "Arrest this man for contempt." The bailiffs did not move. They looked at Scott, who calmly reached under his suit jacket, not pulling a weapon, but pulling a two-way radio. "Supervisor Reynolds," Scott said into the mic, "the Honorable Judge Miller is refusing a federal transfer order. Bring them in." Outside the thick glass windows of the courtroom, the wail of dozens of heavy sirens suddenly erupted, a deafening chorus that signaled the end of an empire. Panic, raw and chaotic, descended upon Oak Ridge. Within 3 minutes of Scott's radio call, heavily armored FBI tactical teams, clad in olive green and carrying matte black rifles, swarmed the courthouse steps. They moved with terrifying efficiency, securing exits, seizing computer servers, and disarming local deputies who were too stunned to offer any resistance. In the chaos of Courtroom 3B, Bruce Miller realized the game was over. While his sister remained frozen on the bench, staring in horror as federal agents poured through the oak doors, Bruce slipped out the side exit reserved for court staff. His mind was a frantic blur of adrenaline and survival instinct. If the feds had wiretaps, he was looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. He needed his go-bag stashed with $50,000 in untraceable cash and a fake passport from his locker at the precinct. But first, he needed to tie up loose ends. He needed to make sure nobody could corroborate the assault on the old man. Miles away, at Nat's Diner and Bakery, Natalie was frantically shoving clothes into a duffel bag in the small back office. She had seen the caravan of black SUVs scream past her diner, heading toward town. She knew something massive was happening, and her instinct told her to run. The bell above the diner door chimed. Natalie froze, her breath catching in her throat. She crept to the office door, peering through the small slat in the blinds. Officer Tiffany stood near the counter. She was out of uniform, wearing jeans and a hoodie pulled up over her head. She looked completely shattered, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, her hands shaking violently as she clutched a manila folder to her chest. Natalie let out a breath and stepped out of the office. "Tiffany, honey, what are you doing here? They're locking down the whole town." "I know," Tiffany sobbed, the dam finally breaking. "I know, Nat. I lied. I lied on the report. Bruce made me do it. He hit that old man for no reason, and I just stood there. I can't do this anymore. I can't be a part of this." Natalie rushed around the counter, wrapping her arms around the trembling younger woman. "It's okay. We have to get out of here, both of us. Leaving would be highly inadvisable right now, ladies." Both women screamed, spinning around. Scott Miller was standing by the jukebox, completely silent. He had slipped in through the back kitchen door. His suit was still impeccable, his demeanor still ice-cold. He walked toward them, pulling a sleek tablet from his jacket. "Agent Scott Miller, FBI," he said, tapping the screen. He turned it around, showing Tiffany a freeze frame of the dashcam footage from her cruiser. "Officer Tiffany, you are currently an accessory after the fact to a federal civil rights violation, perjury, and falsifying a police report." Tiffany collapsed into a booth, burying her face in her hands. "I know. I'm so sorry. I'll turn myself in. I'll give you everything." "I already have everything," Scott said softly, his tone shifting from interrogator to something almost sympathetic. He looked at Natalie. "Including the DVR hard drive you hid in your flower bin, Natalie. My team recovered it 20 minutes ago." Natalie gasped, taking a step back. "How did you?" "We've been watching the Miller family for 2 years," Scott explained, sliding into the booth across from Tiffany. "Which means we've been watching you, Tiffany. I know you're not like them. I know you took this job because your brother died of an overdose, and you wanted to clean up the streets. Bruce Miller is the one supplying those streets." Tiffany's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal. "What?" Scott nodded slowly. "We have the audio. Bruce has been protecting the local meth distributors in exchange for a 20% cut. And what's worse, Tiffany, he was planning to frame you. He told his sister last week that if internal affairs ever came sniffing, they would plant a kilo of seized narcotics in your locker and let you take the fall as the rogue rookie." The revelation struck Tiffany like a physical blow. The crushing guilt she felt over the old man vanished, instantly replaced by a blinding, white-hot fury. The man she had protected, the man she had lied for, had been planning to throw her to the wolves the entire time. "What do you need me to do?" Tiffany asked, her voice suddenly devoid of tears, replaced by cold steel. Scott pulled a small, silver recording device and a pin from his pocket. "Bruce isn't at the courthouse. He bolted. We have teams tracking his phone, but he's turned it off. He's desperate, and desperate men run to their safety nets. He's going to try and access the precinct evidence room to wipe the servers before we get there. I need you to give me his master passcode." The Oak Ridge Police Precinct was a ghost town. The few officers who hadn't been rounded up at the courthouse had abandoned their posts, fleeing into the surrounding county like rats off a sinking ship. The fluorescent lights buzzed aggressively overhead, casting long, sickly shadows down the linoleum corridors. Bruce Miller moved through the back hallway with the frantic, erratic energy of a cornered beast. He had his heavy tactical vest zipped up tight over his polo shirt, his Glock 19 drawn and held at the low ready. He was sweating profusely, his breathing ragged and shallow. The illusion of his invincibility had been shattered so completely and so violently that his mind was fracturing under the weight of reality. He reached the heavy steel door of the evidence room. He punched in his personal access code. Beep. "Access denied." Bruce cursed, slamming his fist against the keypad. He tried it again. Beep. "Access denied." "Looking for this?" Bruce spun around, raising his weapon. Scott Miller was standing at the end of the hallway, 30 feet away. He wasn't taking cover. He wasn't drawing his weapon. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting casually in his suit pockets. In his left hand, he held up a small, black keycard. Tiffany was very cooperative. "Bruce," Scott said, his voice echoing eerily down the empty corridor. "She revoked your access privileges about 5 minutes ago from a federal command post." "You arrogant son of a bitch," Bruce sneered, his hand shaking as he kept the sights of his Glock centered on Scott's chest. "You think you're untouchable because you have a badge? I'll put a hollow point through your heart right here, right now, and disappear into the mountains." "You won't make it to the parking lot," Scott replied, completely unfazed by the weapon pointed at him. He slowly began to walk forward, closing the distance between them. It was a terrifying display of psychological dominance. "There are 12 FBI snipers currently painting the back of your skull with laser sights through the windows behind you. If I drop, you disintegrate." Bruce involuntarily flinched, his eyes darting to the small, frosted windows at the top of the corridor. He couldn't see anything, but the seed of doubt had been planted. He took a nervous step backward, his back hitting the steel door of the evidence room. "Stay back," Bruce barked, his voice cracking, the deep, alpha male drawl completely gone, replaced by the panicked whine of a coward. "You hit my father," Scott said, stopping 10 feet away. His icy demeanor finally cracked, revealing the furnace of absolute rage burning underneath. His voice dropped to a terrifying, guttural whisper. "A 72-year-old man. You shattered his glasses. You made him bleed." He resisted, Bruce yelled, trying to cling to his manufactured reality. "He endured," Scott corrected him. "And now, you are going to pay for it. Put the gun down, Bruce." Instead of dropping the weapon, Bruce's eyes widened with a sudden, manic realization. He wasn't looking at Scott anymore. He was looking past him, down the adjoining hallway. Scott turned slightly. Judge Rebecca Miller was standing there. She had managed to slip away from the courthouse amidst the chaos of the initial raid, fleeing to the precinct in a desperate, foolish attempt to meet up with her brother. She was out of breath, her expensive black robes discarded, leaving her in a wrinkled silk blouse. "Bruce," she gasped, her eyes darting between her brother's gun and the federal agent. "Bruce, what are you doing?" In a move so cowardly, so utterly devoid of human decency that it shocked even Scott, Bruce lunged forward. He didn't attack Scott. He grabbed his own sister. He spun Rebecca around, wrapping a thick, muscular arm around her throat, pulling her tightly against his chest as a human shield. He jammed the barrel of the Glock viciously into her temple. Rebecca let out a strangled shriek of absolute terror, her hands clawing desperately at her brother's arm. "Back off," Bruce screamed, a spray of saliva flying from his lips. His eyes were wide and feral, completely unhinged. "Back the hell off, Fed. I'm walking out of here with her. You try to stop me, and I blow her brains out." Scott stopped. He looked at the horrifying tableau in front of him, a brother, ready to execute his own sister to save his skin. It was the ultimate, grotesque culmination of the Miller family's absolute moral bankruptcy. Scott didn't raise a weapon. He didn't shout. He simply looked at Bruce with a profound, chilling mixture of pity and disgust. "You really don't get it, do you, Bruce?" Scott whispered. "Shut up. Open the back door." Bruce screamed, tightening his grip, making Rebecca choke. "I didn't come down this hallway to arrest you," Scott said, slowly pulling his hands out of his pockets. He tapped the earpiece hidden in his right ear. "I came down this hallway to distract you." Before Bruce could process the words, the ceiling vent directly above him exploded inward. Before Bruce could process Scott's chilling words, the heavy industrial ceiling vent directly above him exploded inward with the deafening, metallic shriek of tearing aluminum. A blinding flash of white light ignited the narrow corridor, followed instantly by a concussive shockwave that sucked the oxygen from the air. It was a customized flashbang grenade, deployed with terrifying precision. The sheer force of the detonation threw Bruce backward against the steel door of the evidence room, his Glock firing a single, wild shot into the fluorescent light fixtures above, showering the hallway in sparks and powdered glass. Through the thick, acrid cloud of white smoke, 3 figures dropped from the ceiling aperture like predatory spiders. They were FBI hostage rescue team operators, clad in heavy Kevlar and night vision goggles. Before Bruce's vision could even clear, before his ringing ears could register the screams of his sister, 190 pounds of tactical armor slammed into his chest. Bruce was driven to the linoleum floor with bone-jarring force. The heavy combat boot of an operator pinned his wrist to the ground, forcing his fingers to splay open. The Glock was kicked away, skittering down the hallway to rest at Scott Miller's polished leather shoes. In less than 3 seconds, Bruce was flipped onto his stomach, his arms wrenched violently behind his back. The cold, unforgiving steel of federal handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, biting into the flesh. "Target secured. Room is clear," the lead operator barked, his voice muffled behind a balaclava. As the smoke began to thin, drawn out through the shattered ventilation shaft, Scott Miller calmly walked forward. He didn't flinch. He didn't cough. He moved with the effortless grace of a man walking through a light drizzle rather than a tactical breach zone. Against the opposite wall, Judge Rebecca Miller was on her hands and knees, gasping for air, her expensive silk blouse covered in drywall dust. Her perfectly coiffed hair was wild and tangled. The moment she realized she was no longer a hostage, the sheer, Animalistic panic in her eyes vanished, instantly replaced by the cold, calculating survival instinct of a corrupt politician. In a plot twist that completely shattered the final remnants of the Miller family's loyalty, Rebecca scrambled to her feet and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at her brother, who was currently bleeding from a small cut on his forehead, pinned beneath the knee of an FBI agent. "He's insane," Rebecca screamed, her voice echoing shrilly in the confined space. "Agent Miller, you have to believe me. I had no idea he was doing any of this. He held me hostage. He threatened to kill me. He forced me to sign those forfeiture orders. I was acting under duress for years." Bruce twisted his neck, his cheek pressed painfully against the cold floor, staring at his sister in absolute, mind-breaking disbelief. The blue wall hadn't just crumbled. His own flesh and blood was enthusiastically shoveling dirt onto his grave. "You treacherous bitch," Bruce roared, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the floor. "You were the one counting the money. You set up the offshore accounts. You signed the fake warrants. Lies, the desperate lies of a violent sociopath." Rebecca shrieked back, desperately trying to smooth down her ruined clothes, attempting to project an aura of judicial authority that had permanently evaporated. She turned to Scott, her eyes wide with manufactured innocence. "Agent Miller, I want immunity. Complete, blanket federal immunity. I can give you the location of his hidden ledger. I can give you the names of every dirty deputy in the Tri-County area. Just keep me out of federal prison." Scott stood over them both, the silence stretching out, heavy with absolute contempt. He looked at Bruce, an apex predator reduced to a squirming, screaming insect. Then he looked at Rebecca, a supposed pillar of justice willing to sell her brother's life for a reduced sentence. "You don't understand how this works, Rebecca," Scott said softly, his voice a razor blade sliding across silk. "Immunity is a currency we offer to small fish to catch the shark. You and your brother are the sharks. Your assets are already frozen. Your offshore accounts were seized by the Treasury Department 20 minutes ago." Rebecca's jaw dropped. The remaining color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a chalk-white corpse. No, that's impossible. Those accounts are encrypted. Your IT administrator has been a confidential informant for the FBI for the last 14 months, Scott revealed, a cold, ghost of a smile touching his lips. It was a twist that drove a final, fatal stake through the heart of her empire. "He handed over the decryption keys this morning in exchange for a plea deal. You have nothing to trade, Rebecca. You are entirely bankrupt." He turned to the HRT operators. "Take them both to the mobile command center. Strip search them, process them, and put them in separate holding cells. Do not let them speak to each other." As the agents hauled Bruce to his feet, the disgraced officer looked at Scott, his eyes burning with a impotent, childish fury. "You think you've won?" Bruce spat. "My lawyers will tie this up for decades. I know the system." "Bruce," Scott whispered, stepping so close that Bruce could see his own pathetic reflection in the agent's dark eyes. "You no longer have a system. You have a concrete box. And when my father goes to sleep tonight in a soft bed, I want you to remember that you put yourself in that box the moment you laid a hand on him." 2 hours later, the dust had settled over Oak Ridge, but the seismic shockwaves of the federal raid were just beginning to spread. The precinct had been entirely commandeered, transformed into a bustling hub of FBI activity. Dozens of agents were meticulously cataloging evidence, seizing hard drives, and bagging stacks of illicit cash found hidden in the drop-ceiling tiles of the break room. In the precinct's interrogation viewing room, Natalie sat wrapped in a thick wool blanket provided by a federal medic. She was drinking a cup of hot tea, her hands finally steady. She had just spent the last hour giving a comprehensive, sworn video deposition, detailing the extortion ring Bruce Miller had run on the local businesses along County Road 9. When she handed over the unedited DVR footage from her diner, the pristine, undeniable recording of Bruce assaulting Leonard, she felt a physical weight lift from her chest. The terror that had dictated her life for years was gone, replaced by a profound, tearful sense of liberation. Down the hall, behind the steel door of the evidence room that Bruce had so desperately tried to access, Scott Miller was standing with Officer Tiffany. Tiffany was no longer wearing the terrified demeanor of a trapped rookie. Under Scott's authoritative shelter, she had found her footing. She was proving invaluable, navigating the labyrinthine, corrupt filing system the Oak Ridge police used to hide their sins. Judge Miller mentioned a ledger, Scott said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous, dimly lit room, lined with chain-link cages full of confiscated property. She was lying about everything else, but her panic about the ledger was genuine. Where is it? Tiffany walked past rows of dusty cardboard boxes. She stopped at the far corner of the room, near a large, industrial floor drain. Bruce didn't trust the digital servers. He always said tech could be traced. If he was hiding the real, physical ledger, the master list of payouts, it wouldn't be in a filing cabinet. It would be in the dead drop. She knelt down, wrapping her fingers around the heavy iron grate of the floor drain. With a sharp grunt of effort, she heaved it upward. It swung open on a hidden, rusted hinge. Scott shone his tactical flashlight down into the hole. It wasn't a drain at all. It was a waterproof, fireproof floor safe, cemented directly into the foundation of the precinct. I saw him opening it once, late at night, when he thought I had gone home, Tiffany explained, her voice steady. I peeked through the blinds. He used a biometric scanner. Good thing we kept his thumbprint on file during processing, Scott muttered dryly. He signaled to an evidence technician standing by the door. Get the bio-bypass kit. Within 5 minutes, the technician had successfully spoofed the scanner using Bruce's freshly acquired prints. The heavy steel door of the safe popped open with a pneumatic hiss. Scott reached inside. He bypassed several thick stacks of $100 bills wrapped in rubber bands, easily $500,000 in liquid cash, and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound accounting book. It was black, worn at the edges, and secured with a brass lock that Scott easily snapped with a pair of bolt cutters. He opened the ledger and laid it on a steel sorting table under the harsh fluorescent lights. Tiffany leaned in, her eyes scanning the handwritten entries. What they saw in those pages unleashed the biggest, most unexpected plot twist of the entire operation. The Miller family wasn't just running an isolated extortion racket in a Sleepy Valley town. As Scott flipped through the pages, his jaw tightened. The ledgers documented massive, recurring cash payouts. But the names listed under the disbursements column weren't just local deputies or street-level distributors. My God, Tiffany whispered, the blood draining from her face as she read a name at the top of page 4. That's State Senator Higgins and District Attorney Vance. It's a blackmail ring, Scott said, his mind rapidly processing the catastrophic scale of the discovery. He traced his finger along a column of dates and dollar amounts. Rebecca wasn't just hoarding the drug money. She was funneling it into the campaign funds of state politicians to ensure legislation passed that kept Oak Ridge off the state oversight grid. She was bribing judges in neighboring counties to redirect lucrative civil litigation cases to her courtroom. Scott looked up, meeting Tiffany's wide, stunned eyes. This single book elevated the case from a local corruption bust to a devastating statewide scandal that would undoubtedly lead to the impeachment of half the governor's cabinet. Bruce and Rebecca thought they were the kings of Oak Ridge, Scott murmured, carefully sliding the ledger into a clear, tamper-proof federal evidence bag. But they were just the bagmen for the real cartel sitting in the state capitol. And now, I have the map to burn them all down. He turned to Tiffany. You gave me the key to the kingdom, Tiffany. When the dust settles, the Bureau is going to need an honest liaison in this county to help us rebuild this department from the ground up. Someone who knows the town, but isn't infected by its rot. Tiffany swallowed hard, a new sense of profound purpose washing over her. She stood up straight, her posture mirroring the dignity of the elderly man she had failed earlier that day. I'm your liaison, Agent Miller. Whatever you need. Good, Scott said, picking up the evidence bag. Because right now, I need to go see my father. The evening sun was dipping below the rugged tree line of the valley, painting the sky in vibrant, bruised hues of purple and gold. A massive crowd of Oak Ridge residents had gathered behind the yellow police tape surrounding the precinct. For decades, they had lived in quiet, suffocating terror of the Miller family. Now, they stood in stunned, breathless silence, watching an empire fall. National news vans, alerted to the massive federal presence, had already set up their satellite dishes, casting the blinding glare of television lights across the precinct's front steps. The heavy glass doors slid open, and the hard karma finally hit the pavement. Bruce and Rebecca Miller were led out into the blinding lights. They were no longer the arrogant king and queen of the county. They were both wearing identical, coarse orange jumpsuits. Heavy iron chains linked their wrists to their waists, and ankle cuffs forced them to shuffle awkwardly, a perfect, poetic mirror of the exact indignity they had forced upon Leonard just hours earlier. The crowd of townspeople erupted. It didn't start as a cheer, but as a collective, visceral roar of release. People who had lost their businesses, people who had been unfairly jailed, people who had been terrorized for simply driving through town, began to applaud. The sound echoed off the granite walls of the precinct, a deafening drumbeat of absolute justice. Bruce kept his head down, his broad shoulders slumped, the arrogant swagger completely annihilated by the crushing reality of his total ruin. The camera flashes popped relentlessly, immortalizing his humiliation for the entire world to see. At the bottom of the steps, parked perfectly under a street lamp so its polished chrome caught the ambient light, sat the 1,968 cherry red Chevrolet Impala. Leaning against the driver's side door was Leonard. He was no longer in the oversized jumpsuit. Scott had retrieved his powder blue linen suit from the evidence locker and had it hastily dry cleaned. Leonard stood tall, his posture as unbroken and majestic as ever. The swelling around his left eye had gone down, leaving a dark bruise that looked less like an injury and more like a badge of honor. He didn't gloat as Bruce was paraded past him. He simply watched, his dark eyes radiating a quiet, profound grace. He watched as the man who had struck him in the dirt was reduced to a shuffling prisoner. Scott walked down the steps, bypassing the gaggle of reporters shouting questions. He walked straight to the Impala. The terrifying, icy federal agent melted away, leaving only a son looking at his father. Scott reached out and pulled Leonard into a tight, fierce embrace. "I'm sorry I was late, Dad," Scott whispered into his father's shoulder. "You were right on time, son," Leonard replied, patting Scott's back with his weathered, calloused hands. "Right on time." A few yards away, the doors to a federal transport van opened. However, it wasn't a federal agent who grabbed Bruce's arm to guide him inside. It was Officer Tiffany. She had a federal windbreaker zipped over her clothes, a temporary deputization badge gleaming on her chest. Bruce looked at her, his eyes filled with a hollow, desperate betrayal. "Tiff, you sold me out." Tiffany looked at the man who had ordered her to lie, who had planned to frame her for his own crimes. She felt absolutely nothing for him but pity. "Watch your head," Tiffany said, her voice devoid of emotion, quoting the exact mocking phrase Bruce used when he violently shoved suspects into cruisers. She placed a hand on the roof of the van and firmly pushed Bruce inside, slamming the heavy metal door shut behind him, locking him in the dark. She turned and locked eyes with Leonard across the parking lot. She offered a small, deeply respectful nod. Leonard nodded back, a silent forgiveness passing between them that Tiffany knew she would carry for the rest of her life. Leonard turned back to his son. "Your Aunt Martha is probably worried sick, and Lily's recital is tomorrow morning. We shouldn't keep them waiting." "No, we shouldn't," Scott smiled. He pulled a pristine set of keys from his pocket retrieved directly from Bruce's confiscated go bag and handed them to his father. Leonard slid behind the wheel of the Impala. The magnificent V8 engine roared to life with a deep, throaty rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very asphalt of Oak Ridge. He put the car in drive, the cherry red paint gleaming under the news lights, and slowly drove out of the town that had tried to break him, leaving the shattered, burning remnants of the Miller Empire in his rearview mirror. Leonard's quiet dignity in the face of violent arrogance proved to be the ultimate catalyst, tearing down a sprawling empire of corruption and reminding us that true power lies not in the badge you wear, but in the integrity of your soul. Bruce Miller learned too late that karma doesn't just knock, it kicks the door down. If this dramatic story of patience, justice, and the ultimate payback resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the truth always comes to light. And don't forget to subscribe for more epic stories of hard karma and unyielding justice. Drop a comment below what was your favorite plot twist. See you in the next one.